March 9th, 1945, 2:15 in the afternoon. Staff Sergeant Walter Kowalczyk lay flat in a drainage ditch outside the village of Bad Kreuznach, with a piece of German shrapnel lodged 2 inches below his collarbone, counting the seconds between mortar rounds because counting was the only thing left that felt like control. 13 men were spread out behind him in that ditch, and the 2 collapsed cellars beside it. 4 of them couldn't walk. One of them, a 19-year-old kid from Baton Rouge named Delacroix, had been unconscious for 6 hours, and nobody in the ditch had the training to know if that was sleep or something worse. They had been in that position for 3 days. They had eaten the last of their K rations on day 2. They had 1 working radio, a canteen of water between 14 men, and a German fire plan so precise that every square foot of open ground around them had already been walked by artillery, which meant every square foot of open ground around them was exactly where the next round was going to land. The Germans had a name for this kind of ground: American intelligence officers, translating captured documents weeks later, would find the phrase and sit with it for a long moment before writing it into their reports. A kill zone. A patch of earth pre-registered by every gun in range, built specifically to receive anyone foolish or unlucky enough to be caught inside it. And Kowalczyk's patrol had walked straight into the middle of one. Nobody back at Battalion wanted to send anyone in after them. That decision, the decision not to send help, is where this story actually starts. Before we get to Patton and what he did when he found out what Battalion had decided, you need to understand exactly how 14 men ended up in that ditch in the first place, and exactly what kind of army was fighting its way across the Rhine in March of 1945. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something special lined up just for you. By March of 1945, Patton's Third Army had been moving faster than any military force in modern history had ever moved. Since the breakout at Avranches the previous August, Third Army had covered more ground against a determined enemy than any army in the history of mechanized warfare, and it had done it with a level of aggression that terrified its own logistics officers as much as it terrified the Germans. Patton's entire theory of war was built on a single, almost childishly simple premise. An enemy that is still moving backward has not yet decided where to make his stand, and an enemy who hasn't decided where to make his stand can be pushed past the point where he ever gets the chance. Speed was not a tactic to Patton. It was closer to a religious conviction. He believed, with total sincerity, that a fast-moving army suffered fewer casualties over the long run than a cautious one, because caution gave the enemy time to dig in, and dug-in Germans killed far more Americans than exposed, retreating ones ever did. The specific stretch of ground Third Army was crossing in March of 1945 made that conviction harder to sustain than it had been the previous summer. The Rhineland is not the open, rolling terrain of northern France, where armored columns could run for 100 miles a day and never lose a tank to anything but mechanical failure. It is river valley country, cut through with tributaries, sunk roads, and steep vineyard terraces that funnel movement into predictable corridors, whether an army wants to be predictable or not. Every village sat in a small depression along a stream. Every stream had a bridge or a ford, and every bridge or ford was a place German gunners had been staring at through binoculars for weeks. Third Army staff had spent the winter learning that speed in this kind of country did not mean driving through open fields at will. It meant reading the ground correctly, identifying the handful of places an advance actually had to pass through, and moving through those places faster than the enemy could react. Reconnaissance elements like Kowalczyk's squad were the tool that made that kind of reading possible. Their entire function was to go first, to find out which of those narrow corridors were clear, and which ones had a company of German infantry and 4 batteries of 88mm guns waiting inside them, so that the tanks and half-tracks coming up behind could avoid finding out the hard way. The stakes behind that pace were not abstract to the men making the decisions. By early March, every officer above the rank of major understood that the war in Europe was entering its final phase, that Germany's collapse was a matter of weeks or months rather than years, and that the position each division held when the fighting finally stopped would shape the political map of post-war Europe for a generation. That knowledge cut 2 ways inside Third Army's command structure. It gave men like Patton every reason to push harder, to close the remaining distance before the enemy could regroup. or before political decisions made far above his pay grade redrew the boundaries of where American troops were allowed to go. And it gave men like Coldwell every reason to hold that same instinct in check, because a war entering its final weeks was, in a strange and quietly bitter way, the worst possible time to lose men to an unnecessary risk. Nobody wanted to be the officer whose name got attached to a casualty report filed in the last month of a war everyone could already see the end of. Both instincts were reasonable. Both instincts were, in their own way, about the same thing, about trying to bring as many men home as possible from a war that both officers could see was almost finished. They simply arrived at opposite conclusions about how best to do it. And for 15 hours in March of 1945, that disagreement played out with 14 men's lives sitting in the balance. That conviction produced extraordinary results. It also produced exactly the kind of situation Sergeant Kowalczyk's squad found itself in on March 6, 1945, 3 days before the mortar round that put shrapnel in his shoulder. Kowalczyk commanded a 14-man reconnaissance element attached to the 11th Armored Division, part of the leading edge of Patton's push toward the Rhine. Their job was simple on paper and murderous in practice. Move ahead of the main column, identify German positions, radio back coordinates, and pull out before the enemy could react. They had done this successfully 11 times in the previous 3 weeks. On the 12th attempt, they walked into a trap that had been built specifically for men doing exactly what they were doing. The squad itself was, by the standards of the division, an unremarkable collection of men, which is precisely what made them good at their job. Kowalczyk had been a coal miner's son from Scranton before the war, a man whose idea of leadership had less to do with speeches and more to do with checking, every single night regardless of how exhausted he was, that each of his men still had dry socks. His assistant squad leader, a corporal named Frank Ostrowski, had been a school teacher in civilian life, a fact the rest of the squad found endlessly amusing given how thoroughly he had adapted to a job that involved crawling through mud and calling in artillery on other human beings. There was a radio man, a wiry conson named Pruitt, who had somehow developed a reputation for coaxing working transmissions out of equipment that should have been sent back for repair 3 campaigns earlier. And there was Guidry, the Louisiana farm boy, and Delacroix, the youngest man in the squad by 2 years, and 8 others whose names appear in the after-action reports, but who left behind less in the historical record. Ordinary young men from ordinary American towns, who had been asked to do an extraordinarily dangerous job, and had, for 11 straight missions, done it well enough to walk away. German tactical doctrine by early 1945 had shifted. The Wehrmacht no longer had the manpower or the armor to hold a continuous front against Patton's advance, and German commanders knew it. What they still had, in abundance, was artillery, and German artillery officers had spent the winter perfecting something American units would come to fear more than almost anything else in the European theater. They identified the natural choke points that any advancing American reconnaissance patrol would be forced to use, the drainage ditches and sunken roads and low ground that offered cover from direct fire, and they pre-registered every gun within range on those exact coordinates. The Americans called it walking into a box. The Germans, in their own after-action language, called it simply a Feuersack, a fire sack, a place designed to look like safety and function as a trap. The doctrine behind the fire sack was not improvised. German artillery officers had refined it across 3 years of retreating warfare, first on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, and then, as the war turned westward, against the Americans and British pushing in from Normandy. The logic was almost administrative in its coldness. An artillery battery could not physically track every moving target across a battlefield, but it did not need to. It only needed to know where an exhausted, exposed infantry unit would instinctively go for cover, because human beings under fire behave predictably. They run for the low ground. They run for the ditch, the sunken road, the collapsed cellar, anything that breaks the line of sight to incoming fire. German gunners had spent months walking the terrain around likely American approach routes, identifying exactly those instinctive shelter points, and pre-calculating the precise elevation and charge settings needed to drop rounds onto each one without a single ranging shot wasted. By the time an American patrol dove for what looked like the safest cover available, the guns responsible for killing them had often already been dialed in for weeks. Captured German gunnery logs recovered later in the campaign showed entries for individual drainage ditches and hollow roads going back to January. Coordinates logged and re-verified long before any American soldier ever set foot near them. Kowalczyk's squad found the ditch outside Bad Kreuznach because it was the only cover for 400 yards in any direction. They found out it was a fire sack 12 minutes later, when the first ranging round landed close enough to fill 3 men's boots with dirt, and the second round, corrected and precise, killed Private First Class Raymond Hutchins instantly, and wounded 2 more men badly enough that carrying them out under fire became a physical impossibility. Hutchins had turned 22 11 days earlier, a fact Ostrowski remembered clearly enough decades later to mention it. Unprompted, in nearly every interview he ever gave about that patrol. As though the arithmetic of it, a man dead 11 days after his birthday, was the single detail that made the whole afternoon impossible to file away as simply another casualty report. Kowalczyk made the only call available to him. He ordered his men down, ordered radio silence broken just long enough to transmit their position and situation, and settled in to wait for extraction. The extraction did not come, not because nobody heard the call, because somebody heard it and made a decision. The officer who received Kowalczyk's transmission was a battalion operations officer named Captain Everett Coldwell, a competent, careful man who had earned a reputation in the division for exactly the kind of caution that had kept his own casualty numbers lower than most of his peers. Coldwell was 31 years old, older than most captains in a division built largely around men in their early 20s, and he had come up through the ranks slowly and deliberately, the kind of officer whose promotions had less to do with battlefield flair and more to do with a consistent record of bringing his men home in roughly the numbers he had taken out with him. His fellow officers respected him without particularly liking him, in the specific way soldiers sometimes respect a man whose caution has clearly saved lives, even when that same caution makes him difficult to serve alongside in the moment. Coldwell looked at the coordinates Kowalczyk had radioed in, cross-referenced them against known German artillery positions in the sector, and reached a conclusion that was, by every conventional standard of military risk assessment, entirely reasonable. Sending a relief column into a confirmed pre-registered kill zone in daylight would likely cost more men than it saved. Coldwell's math wasn't wrong. It was the kind of math that gets taught in staff colleges and written into field manuals, the calculation every competent officer is trained to make when the numbers on one side of the ledger threaten to outweigh the numbers on the other. He ordered the relief column held at the assembly point. He noted in his log that extraction would be attempted after dark, when reduced visibility might lower German targeting accuracy enough to justify the risk. He did not know, when he wrote that note, that after dark was almost 15 hours away, and he did not know that one of the 14 men in that ditch was already bleeding internally, in a way that 15 hours would turn from survivable to fatal. Word of the decision reached Kowalczyk over the radio in 4 clipped words. Hold position, extraction delayed. He read those 4 words to his men, in a voice that gave away nothing, because giving away something in that ditch, at that moment, would have cost more than the shrapnel already had. What Kowalczyk's 14 men did over the following 3 days is the kind of thing that rarely makes it into official histories, because official histories are built out of orders and movements and casualty counts, and what happened in that ditch was smaller and slower and more human than any of that. They rationed water by the mouthful. They rotated the 2 men still capable of holding a rifle steady on watch in 2-hour shifts, because 2 hours was as long as exhaustion and hunger allowed anyone to stay useful. They kept Hutchins's body in the ditch with them, because moving it meant exposure, and none of them were willing to spend a life, even a spent one, on that particular errand. A private named Guidry, who had worked summers on his uncle's farm in Louisiana, and had some rough field knowledge of wounds, packed Kowalczyk's shoulder with a strip of shirt and told him with total confidence that it looked worse than it was, which both of them understood to be a lie, told out of necessity rather than conviction. They talked, in low voices, about home. They did not talk about the mortars, because the mortars did not need discussion. Every man in that ditch could feel, in the pit of his stomach, exactly how close the last 3 rounds had landed, and none of them needed to be told what the next close one would mean. The first night was, according to the men who later described it, the worst in a purely psychological sense, because it was the night none of them had expected. Every man in that ditch had assumed, When Kowalczyk read out the four-word delay, that dark meant hours, not a full night and the day beyond it. Pruitt kept the radio wrapped in his jacket to protect what little battery life remained, checking in on a schedule Kowalczyk set deliberately sparse, once every 4 hours, because every transmission burned power they could not replace. Ostrowski, the former schoolteacher, spent part of that first night doing what he later described to his own children as the only teaching he ever did that actually mattered, moving quietly between the wounded and talking to each of them in a low, steady voice about nothing consequential, because a voice that sounded calm was, in that ditch, its own kind of medicine. Kowalczyk did not sleep. He would later tell an interviewer that he was not sure, looking back, whether that was discipline or simply fear doing the job discipline usually did. By the second day, the physical reality of the ditch had started working against them in ways that had nothing to do with German artillery. The March weather in the Rhineland that year ran cold and wet, and the men had no dry ground to lie on, no fire they could risk lighting, and no way to warm the two most severely wounded men beyond huddling bodies close enough to share heat. One of the wounded, a private named Halloran who had taken shrapnel in the thigh during the second barrage, developed a fever by the second afternoon that Guidry recognized, from nothing more than farm instinct and a few first aid lectures, as the kind of sign that meant infection was setting in faster than any of them had equipment to fight. There was no morphine left by that point. There had been exactly enough for Hutchins in his last conscious minutes, and for Halloran in the first hour after his wound, and none after that, which meant every hour that followed was managed with nothing but pressure, rationed water, and the particular stubborn will of young men who had decided, without ever discussing it out loud, that none of them were going to be the second man that ditch took. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the morning of March 9th, 3 days in, 4 men could not walk, 1 man was unconscious, and had been for most of a night. Water was down to half a canteen shared 14 ways, and the temperature had dropped low enough overnight that 2 of the wounded had developed the gray, slowed speech that field medics recognized as the early signs of shock, compounding with exposure. Kowalczyk got on the radio one more time. He did not ask for extraction. He had learned, over 3 days, that asking hadn't worked. He asked instead for something smaller, something he thought might actually be granted. He asked for artillery to hit the German positions directly north of his location, the ones responsible for the mortar fire, in the hope that suppressing them might create enough of a window for his men to move on their own. That request landed on the desk of a different officer than the first one had, because shift rotations had changed and Captain Coldwell was, by that point, asleep for the first time in nearly 2 days. It landed instead in front of a young lieutenant colonel serving as Third Army's forward liaison to the division, a man whose job that week happened to include briefing General Patton personally on unit status along the advance. And that lieutenant colonel, reading Kowalczyk's request alongside the log entry showing the squad had already been pinned for 3 days with no extraction attempted, made a decision that would turn out to matter more than anything Coldwell had done. He decided this was something Patton needed to hear about directly, that morning, before his scheduled briefing was even finished. Patton was, by every account of the men who served closest to him, at his most dangerous, when he was calm. His staff had learned over 3 years of combat command that the volume of his voice told you almost nothing about how serious the moment actually was. The famous eruptions, the profanity, the theatrical rage, those were often reserved for smaller irritations, the kind of thing that could be vented and then forgotten within the hour. It was the quiet moments, the ones where his jaw set and his eyes went flat and still, that his staff had learned to fear. By March of 1945, Patton had commanded Third Army for 8 months, long enough for his staff to have compiled, mostly through hard-won experience, an informal catalog of his moods and what each of them tended to predict. The shouting mood, they had learned, usually passed as quickly as it arrived and rarely changed a single operational decision. The quiet mood was the one that got units moved, officers reassigned, and, occasionally, the one that got a subordinate's career ended before lunch. He listened to the full report on Kowalczyk's squad without interrupting once. He asked 3 questions. How long had the men been pinned? Why had extraction not been attempted? And who had made that call? When the lieutenant colonel answered the 3rd question with Captain Coldwell's name, Patton set down the coffee cup he had been holding, with a precision that his aide, a major named Charles Codman, who kept detailed diaries of his time with Patton, would later describe as more unsettling than if the general had thrown it across the room. "Get me a map," Patton said, "and get me Coldwell on the phone." What happened over the next 90 minutes has been reconstructed from 3 separate sources. Codman's diary, which records the sequence of events with the flat precision of a man documenting something he understood at the time, was historically significant. A after-action statement, filed by the lieutenant colonel, who brought Patton the report. And, decades later, a set of oral history interviews conducted with 2 of the surviving members of Kowalczyk's squad, recorded when they were old men willing, finally, to talk about the details they had carried privately for most of their lives. Patton got Coldwell on the field telephone, and did not raise his voice once during the entire conversation, which every man in the command tent that morning would later say was the single most frightening thing they had ever witnessed him do. He asked Coldwell to walk him through his reasoning. Coldwell, to his credit, did not attempt to hide behind procedure or pass responsibility upward. He explained his calculation plainly. Confirmed pre-registered artillery, daylight movement, historical loss ratios for relief operations into similar kill zones. He was, in the language of his training, entirely correct. Patton listened to the whole explanation without a single interruption. Then he asked one question that Coldwell, interviewed decades later by a division historian, said he had never forgotten and never fully recovered from. Patton asked him how many men he thought Third Army had lost, over the course of the entire war, to officers who did the correct math and left men to die doing it. Coldwell did not have an answer. Patton did not wait for one. "I want a relief column moving toward that position within the hour," Patton said. "I want it moving under a smoke screen. And I want every gun in range hitting that German artillery position before the column so much as clears the tree line. And Captain, if I find out you sat on this decision for one more minute than it took you to give this order, you will not be commanding anything by sundown. Is that understood?" It was understood. What followed was one of the more remarkable improvised operations of Third Army's advance across the Rhineland, thrown together in under an hour by men who, 90 minutes earlier, had believed the operation was on hold until nightfall. Patton did not simply order the relief column forward and return to his other business. He personally directed the artillery officer to concentrate every available battery on the German mortar positions identified from Kowalczyk's coordinates, a decision that pulled fire support away from 2 other sectors of the advance and drew immediate objections from officers worried about weakening those positions. Patton overruled every one of those objections in under a minute. He ordered a smoke screen laid down along the entire approach route to the ditch, a technique normally reserved for major armored assaults rather than a 14-man extraction, because he wanted the relief column moving through cover so thick the German spotters would be firing blind. And in a detail that would become the single most talked about element of the entire operation among the men of Third Army in the weeks that followed, Patton climbed into a jeep himself and moved forward to a position close enough to the front that his own aides spent the entire drive trying, unsuccessfully, to talk him into staying back. He was not there to lead the extraction. He had no illusions about being useful crawling into a drainage ditch at 60 years old. He was there, according to Codman's diary, because he wanted the men doing the extraction to know that the order had come from him directly, and he wanted to be close enough to see with his own eyes whether the men who had been sitting in that hole for 3 days were going to walk out of it alive. Assembling the relief force in under an hour meant pulling men and equipment from wherever they happened to be, and the platoon that ended up moving toward Bad Kreuznach that morning was, in the truest sense, improvised. Its core came from a company that had been resting in reserve less than a mile from the assembly point, men who had been told they had the day off, and were instead handed rifles and told to mount up within 20 minutes. The 2 half-tracks assigned to the operation had been earmarked that morning for a supply run to a forward fuel depot, a run that got quietly canceled the moment word of Patton's order came down the line. The medic, a corporal named Aldo Ferrara, who had trained as a pharmacist's assistant before the war, had been asleep for less than 2 hours, after a brutal overnight shift, treating casualties from an unrelated skirmish, when he was shaken awake and told to grab his bag. Ferrara later said the entire experience felt less like a planned military operation, and more like watching a very large, very disciplined machine improvise itself into existence out of spare parts, which, in a sense, was exactly what it was. The relief column reached the ditch at 11:40 that morning, under a smoke screen thick enough that the lead sergeant, a career infantryman named Bill Osterhaus, said afterward he could barely see his own hand in front of his face for most of the approach. German artillery fired blind into the smoke, landing rounds that came close, but, for the first time in 3 days, came close to nothing. Osterhaus's men found Kowalczyk's squad exactly where the radio transmission had placed them. 13 living men and 1 dead one, 4 of the 13 unable to move under their own power. One of them, Delacroix, still unconscious but breathing, which after 3 days was the single best piece of news anyone in that ditch had received. Getting 13 men and 1 body out of a fire sack under a moving smoke screen is not a clean, cinematic operation. It is men half carrying, half dragging other men across broken ground, while artillery lands close enough to feel through your boots. And it took the better part of 40 minutes. And at one point, a shell landed close enough to the extraction line that Osterhaus lost his footing and came up with a ringing in his left ear that, by his own account decades later, never fully went away. Ferrara worked on Halloran, and on the second badly wounded man, a private named Chesik, in the open, on the move, because there was no time to stop and no cover worth stopping for, applying pressure and plasma expander. While the extraction line kept moving toward the tree line, the smoke was supposed to be hiding them from. Ostrovsky carried Delacroix's litter for most of the distance himself, refusing twice to be relieved by fresher men from the relief platoon. A decision his squad mates later attributed less to physical necessity and more to something he needed to do for himself after 3 days of being unable to do anything at all. But at 12:22 in the afternoon, on March 9, 1945, 13 living members of Kowalczyk's squad crossed back behind American lines, and Patton was standing at the edge of the collection point when they arrived. He did not give a speech. Every account of that afternoon agrees on this point specifically, that the general who was famous across 2 continents for his theatrical addresses to his troops said almost nothing at all when the men came in. He walked down the line of stretchers. He stopped at each one. He asked each conscious man his name and where he was from, and he told Kowalczyk, whose shoulder had gone gray and swollen under Guidry's makeshift dressing, that he was putting him in for a decoration before Kowalczyk had even finished giving his name in full. When he reached the unconscious Delacroix, he stood over the stretcher for a long moment, according to Codman's diary, and then turned to the medical officer standing nearby and asked, in a voice Codman described as unusually quiet, whether the boy was going to live. The medical officer said he didn't know yet. Patton nodded once and said that he wanted to know the moment there was an answer, one way or another, and he wanted that answer brought to him personally, not filtered through a report. Delacroix lived. It took him 6 weeks in a field hospital, and then a longer convalescence back in England, and the injury that had kept him unconscious for most of 3 days, a combination of exposure, dehydration, and a mild concussion from a mortar strike near miss on the first day, left him with headaches that troubled him on and off for the rest of his life. But he lived, and in 1987, at a Third Army reunion in Columbus, Ohio, he told the story of that ditch to a room of aging veterans and their families, and by every account of the men who were there, it was the first time most of them had heard the full version. Halloran and Chesik, the 2 men whose wounds had made carrying them out under fire physically impossible for 3 straight days, both survived as well, though neither man's recovery was simple. Halloran lost the leg below the knee 8 days after the extraction, when the infection Guidry had first spotted in the ditch proved to have gone further than field surgeons initially believed, and he spent the better part of 2 years in stateside hospitals, learning to walk again on a prosthetic that, by his own later account, never stopped aching in cold weather for the rest of his life. Chesik's wound healed cleanly enough that he returned to limited duty within 4 months, a recovery so much faster than anyone in the squad expected that Ferrara, the medic who had worked on him in the open during the extraction itself, later called it the one piece of good luck the whole operation had produced. Both men attended the same 1987 reunion where Delacroix told the full story publicly for the first time, and both, according to attendees, stood at the back of the room and said almost nothing throughout, the way men sometimes do when a story belongs to someone else to tell, even though they lived through every hour of it themselves. What Patton did after the extraction is, in some ways, the more interesting part of this story, and it's the part your reference footage on Patton's rages and confrontations tends to leave out, because it doesn't fit the caricature of the man as pure blood and guts theater. He did not simply reprimand Captain Coldwell and move on. He relieved him of his position as battalion operations officer that same afternoon, a decision that ended Coldwell's combat command role for the remainder of the war, and reassigned him to a logistics post well behind the lines. This was, by the standards of the United States Army in 1945, an unusually severe consequence for a decision that had not technically violated any regulation. Coldwell had followed doctrine. He had made a defensible calculation under uncertainty, the exact kind of calculation officers are trained and expected to make. Patton relieved him anyway, and when questioned about it by a staff officer who worried the decision would be seen as unjust, given that Coldwell had broken no rule, Patton reportedly said that rules were the floor, not the ceiling, and that an officer who needed a rule to tell him not to leave 14 men dying in a ditch for 15 hours had no business commanding other men's lives, regardless of what any regulation permitted. Coldwell's own account of the reassignment, given decades later to a division historian compiling oral histories of the Rhineland campaign, was more measured than the anger of that morning's phone call might suggest. He did not describe himself as a man wronged by an unreasonable superior. He described the reassignment as the correct outcome of an incorrect decision, language that surprised the historian interviewing him, who had expected, after so many years, at least a trace of bitterness. Coldwell told him instead that he had replayed the calculation in his head more times than he could count in the years since, and that the math had never once come out differently, which was, in his telling, the whole problem. The math had been right. The math simply hadn't been the only thing that mattered, and it had taken Patton's phone call, and the 15 hours that followed it, for him to understand the difference in a way that no staff college lecture had ever managed to teach him. He spent the rest of the war in a logistics post outside Nancy, returned home in 1946, and went on to a long career in municipal administration in Ohio, a career, he said, that he approached for the rest of his life with a specific and permanent discomfort around any decision that could be fully justified by a spreadsheet. That is, on its own, a debate historians have had for decades. Some argue Patton's treatment of Coldwell was exactly the kind of arbitrary, temperament-driven command decision that made him simultaneously the most effective and most dangerous general officer in the European theater. A man whose personal moral instincts sometimes overrode the careful systems the Army had built, specifically to prevent commanders from making decisions based on emotion rather than sound tactical reasoning. Others argue that Coldwell's math, however defensible on paper, represented exactly the kind of bureaucratic risk aversion that had, across the broader war, cost far more American lives through slowness and caution than aggression ever had, and that Patton's willingness to override that calculation, even at the cost of due process for one officer, saved 13 men who would otherwise be a footnote in a casualty report. Both readings have serious defenders. Neither one makes the other one wrong. What is not in dispute is what Patton did in the days immediately following the extraction, because this is where the story stops being about one relief operation and starts being about something closer to a policy shift. Patton called a meeting of his senior operations officers within 48 hours of the Kowalczyk extraction, and according to two separate memoirs written by officers who were present, he used that meeting to issue an order that would affect every subsequent reconnaissance operation conducted by Third Army for the rest of the war in Europe. He mandated that any unit reporting itself pinned or cut off inside enemy fire zones was to have extraction attempted within 2 hours of the initial report, regardless of daylight conditions, unless the commanding general himself personally overruled the timeline based on specific tactical intelligence. He mandated that any officer choosing to delay an extraction beyond that window would be required to justify that decision directly to him, in person, rather than through a written report that could sit unread on a desk for hours, and in a detail that several veterans specifically remembered decades later as evidence of how personally Patton had taken the incident. He ordered that every reconnaissance patrol moving ahead of the main column be equipped with a second radio and a backup battery, because Kowalczyk's squad had come dangerously close to losing radio contact entirely on the second day when their single-sets battery began to fail, and Patton did not intend to let a piece of equipment be the reason a rescue never happened again. Supply officers grumbled about the redundant radio requirement, because radios and batteries were never in unlimited supply, and doubling the allocation for every forward patrol meant shortages elsewhere. Patton's response to those complaints, recorded by his aide, was characteristically blunt. He said he would rather run short on radios in the rear than run short on living men at the front, and he did not want to hear the argument again. The 2-hour extraction policy was tested for real, less than 3 weeks later, near the town of Bad Kreuznach, when a different reconnaissance element from a different division found itself pinned by machine gun fire in a sunken farm lane. The circumstances were not identical. The terrain was different, and the German unit responsible was regular infantry rather than the kind of pre-registered artillery trap that had caught Kowalczyk's men. But the operations officer who received that unit's distress call, aware of what had happened outside Bad Kreuznach 3 weeks earlier, and aware, specifically, of what had happened to Coldwell afterward, did not wait 15 hours to make a decision. He had a relief column moving within 40 minutes. Every man in that sunken lane came out alive, a fact one of the survivors later attributed, in a post-war letter to a hometown newspaper, directly and by name to the new policy that had come down from 3rd Army headquarters after an incident he had heard about only secondhand. The men of the 11th Armored Division heard about the Kowalczyk extraction within days. The way these things travel through an army faster than any official communication ever manages. What stuck with them, according to the oral histories collected decades later, was not primarily the drama of the rescue itself, dramatic as it was. It was the specific detail of Patton climbing into a jeep and moving forward personally, rather than issuing the order from a command tent miles behind the line. Soldiers who had spent years hearing about Patton's ivory-handled pistols, and his theatrical speeches, and his infamous slapping of a hospitalized soldier in Sicily 2 years earlier, an incident that had nearly ended his career and had permanently shaped how much of the American public understood the man, found themselves confronted with a different version of the same general. Not a man performing toughness for an audience, but a man who, when he heard 14 of his soldiers were dying slowly in a ditch because a careful officer had done careful math, drove toward the sound of the guns to make sure the order got carried out. This is the tension that runs through almost everything written about George Patton, and it's worth sitting with honestly, rather than smoothing it over into a simple hero narrative, because the historical record doesn't support a simple hero narrative, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to the men who actually lived through his command. Patton was, without question, a deeply flawed man by even the standards of his own era. His treatment of the soldier in Sicily, a young man suffering from what would now be immediately recognized as combat-related psychological trauma, remains one of the genuinely indefensible moments of his career, and no amount of context excuses it. He held views about race, about the role of women, about a dozen other subjects, that were regressive even relative to many of his contemporaries. He was frequently reckless with his own reputation, and occasionally reckless with the strategic patience his superiors needed from him. None of that is in dispute, and none of it should be minimized in service of a cleaner story. But the men who served under him, particularly the enlisted men who did the actual fighting and dying, tended to describe a more complicated relationship with him than the public caricature allows for. And the Kowalczyk extraction is one of the clearest documented examples of why. Patton's aggression, the same instinct that made him terrifying to serve under during the grinding advances of the previous winter, was the identical instinct that sent him forward in a jeep on March 9, 1945, rather than letting a defensible bureaucratic calculation cost 13 men their lives. His impatience with caution, the trait that exhausted his own logistics officers throughout the war, was the same trait that made him relieve an officer for following correct procedure at the cost of human life. It is entirely possible, and the historical record suggests it is in fact accurate, to hold both of these realities about the same man at the same time. He could be cruel and reckless in one context and be the single reason 14 men lived through a specific afternoon in another. History rarely offers the clean, single-note portraits that get handed down in textbooks, and Patton is one of the clearest examples of why that's true. Kowalczyk himself received the Silver Star for his conduct in holding his squad together over 3 days of sustained artillery fire, and he carried the shrapnel scar on his shoulder for the rest of his life, as what he later described, in an interview with a division historian in the 1990s, as a permanent reminder of exactly how close the math had come to going the other way. He did not speak often about the incident to his own family in the years immediately after the war, a pattern common to an entire generation of veterans who returned home and simply tried to build ordinary lives on top of experiences that resisted being made ordinary. He went back to Pennsylvania, worked in a steel mill for 31 years, married, raised 3 children, and only began speaking publicly about the 3 days in that ditch when his grandchildren, decades later, started asking questions for a school history project. He died in 2001, and at his funeral, according to a local newspaper account, his family read aloud from a letter he had written but never sent, addressed to Patton, thanking him for the specific decision to override Coldwell's timeline, rather than for anything else the general had done during the war. Ostrowski, the schoolteacher who had carried Delacroix's litter for most of the distance out of the ditch, went back to his classroom in Ohio in 1946 and taught American history for another 28 years. And by the account of former students interviewed for a local oral history project in the 2000s, he mentioned the war exactly once a year, on the anniversary of the extraction, and never elaborated beyond a single sentence about a young private he had carried out of a ditch in Germany. Pruitt, the radio man whose stubborn maintenance of a failing set had kept the squad in contact with Battalion at all, went home to Kansas, married, and spent the rest of his working life as a telephone lineman, a career choice several of his surviving squadmates later noted, with quiet amusement, seemed almost too fitting to be coincidence. Osterhaus, the sergeant who led the relief platoon through the smoke and lost most of the hearing in one ear to a near miss during the extraction, stayed in the Army after the war and made a full career of it, retiring as a master sergeant in 1968 after tours that took him through Korea and, briefly, an advisory posting in Vietnam. He rarely spoke about Bad Kreuznach in any formal setting, and the fullest account of that morning to survive in his own words comes from a set of cassette tapes he recorded for his children in the early 1990s, intended as a private family record rather than anything meant for publication, in which he described the 40 minutes in the smoke as the only period of his entire military career when he genuinely believed, moment to moment, that the operation might fail outright. Ferrara, the medic, pulled off 2 hours of sleep to join the column, finished his degree in pharmacy after the war on the GI Bill, and ran a small drugstore in New Jersey for 4 decades, and told a local newspaper on the 50th anniversary of VE Day that he had thought about Chesick and Halloran, by name, at least once a week for 50 straight years, an admission the reporter noted he delivered, without any visible emotion at all, in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a man simply stating something true. Delacroix, the private who spent most of 3 days unconscious, became something of an informal historian of his own unit's story in his later years, tracking down and interviewing as many of the other 12 survivors as he could locate before age and illness took them, one by one, over the decades that followed the war. He was, by all accounts, the man most responsible for the oral history record that exists today, the one who understood, earlier than most of his fellow veterans, that the specific details of that ditch, the rationing of water by the mouthful, the 2-hour watch rotations, the 4 words that came back over the radio on the first day, would disappear entirely from the historical record, unless somebody made the effort to write them down while the people who lived them were still alive to remember them accurately. He conducted his last interview, with Guidry, in a nursing home outside Baton Rouge in 1996, less than a year before Guidry's death, and by Delacroix's own account, it took most of an afternoon before Guidry, then in his early 70s, and frail in ways the young man in that ditch had never been, was willing to talk in detail about the packed shoulder wound and the lie he had told about how bad it looked. There is a version of this story that ends simply with Patton as the hero who broke the rules to save his men, and that version is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. The fuller version includes Captain Coldwell, a competent officer who made a defensible decision using the exact reasoning the Army had trained him to use, and who paid a career-altering price for a calculation that, on a different day, with different men in that ditch, might have been the correct call that saved lives elsewhere. It includes the young lieutenant colonel, who made the judgment call to interrupt Patton's morning briefing with an urgent report, rather than letting it work through normal channels, a decision that receives almost no attention in most accounts of this incident, but which arguably mattered as much as anything Patton himself did, because none of what followed happens if that report sits in a queue for another 6 hours. It includes 13 men who rationed water and took turns watching for movement and kept a dead friend's body with them in a ditch for 3 days rather than leave him behind, because that is what the actual experience of combat asked of them, long before any general arrived to change the outcome. And it includes the uncomfortable, unresolved question sitting underneath the entire episode. The one that historians studying command decision-making in combat still argue about today. When does aggressive, rule-breaking intervention represent genuine moral courage? And when does it represent a commander substituting his own gut instinct for a system specifically designed to remove exactly that kind of unpredictability from decisions where lives are at stake? Patton got it right on March 9, 1945. 13 men are alive because he did. But the same instinct that sent him forward in that jeep had, at other points across his career, produced decisions that cost lives rather than saved them. Decisions born of the identical impatience with caution that made him a hero to the men of Kowalczyk's squad. The Third Army that fought its way across Europe under his command was faster and more aggressive than any comparable force in the war. And that aggression carried a cost in blood that ran in both directions, saving men in ditches on some days, and pushing exhausted units past reasonable limits on others. None of that complexity takes anything away from what happened outside Bad Kreuznach on March 9, 1945. 14 men went into a fire sack. 13 came out alive, and the 14th, Raymond Hutchins, was carried out rather than left behind, which mattered enormously to the men who carried him, and to the family who eventually received his remains, rather than simply a telegram and a grave marker somewhere they would never visit. A general who could have accepted a careful officer's careful math instead climbed into a jeep and drove toward the sound of German artillery, to make certain an order got followed. And an army that had spent years perfecting the doctrine of calculated risk found itself, for a handful of hours in March of 1945, run by a man who decided that some calculations were not worth making at all. The ditch outside Bad Kreuznach is farmland today. There is no marker there, no plaque, nothing to tell a visitor walking that ground that 14 American soldiers once spent 3 days pinned inside what German artillery officers had built specifically to kill them. The only record that survives is the one carried, for most of a lifetime, by the men who were there, and by the historians and grandchildren, who eventually convinced a handful of them to say it out loud, before it disappeared with them. That is true of most of these stories. The ground forgets. The paperwork gets filed and boxed and eventually digitized into an archive nobody visits. What survives is whatever gets told, out loud, by someone who was there, to someone willing to listen and pass it forward. Stories like this one travel an unusual road to reach an audience decades later, and it is worth being honest about the shape of that road, rather than pretending every detail arrived in a straight, unbroken line from a field radio to a History Channel script. Some of what survives comes from official after-action reports, typed up under deadline by tired clerks working from second-hand accounts. Some comes from private diaries never meant for publication, written by aides and officers who had no way of knowing which afternoon would end up mattering to anyone besides themselves. And a great deal of it comes from oral history, from old men sitting across a table from a grandchild or a local historian decades after the fact, reaching for details that time and age had inevitably softened, sharpened, or quietly rearranged. None of that makes the underlying truth of what happened in that ditch less real. It does mean that a story like this one is best understood, the way most surviving combat history should be understood, as a faithful reconstruction built from imperfect human memory, rather than a courtroom transcript. And that distinction matters even when, maybe especially when, the story is one worth telling. 13 men walked out of that ditch, because a general refused to accept a reasonable delay. That is the whole story, and it is also not nearly the whole story. And both of those things are true at once, which is generally how the real history of any war actually works, once you get close enough to see it clearly. If you've been watching this channel for a while, and still haven't subscribed, now is the moment. Hit the button, turn on the notification bell, and join the community. We are here every day with the military history stories that deserve to be told straight, without softening what was hard, and without forgetting what was, in its own way, exactly right. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget what they were fighting against. We will see you in the next video.